Okay, let's talk about osteichthyes, class osteichthyes. We've just completed our lecture on chondrichthyes and anathens. Those were your jawless fish, your anathens, and chondrichthyes were cartilage fish. And so right now what we want to do is we want to pick up with osteichthyes. And osteichthyes means bony fish. Oste refers to bone, ichthyes referring to fish, therefore osteichthyes are bony fish. They are characterized by cranial bones. They do have a lower jaw. They do have a head and pectoral girdle that's covered with large dermal bones to protect the organs such as the heart, the brain, the eyes, etc. The eyeball does have a protective sclerotic ring. They do have an inner ear. So they can hear. So that old adage when you go fishing, hey, you need to be quiet, the fish can hear you. That's what we're talking about, especially vibrations. And they do have a brain case. Now another thing that they have that is very interesting is they have a lung or a swim bladder. And the reason that's important is because, you know, your chondrichthyes, your sharks, they had to constantly be moving. Your rays, they have the spiracles. The water constantly had to flush over the gills. Well, in the case of osteichthyes, they have a swim bladder, and this allows them to be able to rise and to fall, right, in the water column. In other words, to go up and to go down vertically, whereas a shark would have to swim at an angle to come up. That covering, that operculum, is going to help them breathe. That's going to wash that fluid over their gills so they can actually stay in one place instead of having to constantly move or be in the water current. Obviously, if they're osteichthyes, they have bones. They have a bony fin rays. I mentioned that swim bladder. That's going to help buoy them up. They are also able to see in color. So this is why many fishermen will make sure that their line is a monofilament color, like one color or the color of the water. It's why they make sure their lures are certain colors, because these fish can actually be attracted depending on if it's morning, afternoon, middle of the day, nighttime, you know, seasons. They actually look for certain color prey. So again, that's why that's important, is because they can see in color. Now another thing that's really interesting about osteichthyes is that they their bones originate from echondral bone, and echondral bone starts out as cartilage. And what's interesting about that is that's us too. You know, when a baby, or when the egg and the sperm come together to form the zygote, and the zygote forms the fetus and all that, and the fetus is developing, what will happen is it starts out as a cartilaginous material that it then turns into bone. It ossifies. Imagine what childbirth would be like if the baby was completely, all of the bones were developed trying to exit out of the female. It would, you know, be very, very painful. So this idea of echondral ossification is interesting because we too show echondral ossification. When we look at the fish, when we look at the external anatomy, obviously you see the eyes, you see the nares. Nares is what they're called on the outside, nostrils in the inside. They have the mouth. They have that operculum. I told you that's very important because it covers the gills and it can kind of flap back and forth and kind of keep the water moving over the gills. Therefore, they can kind of stay still. Notice their pectoral fins on the side, pelvic fins right under it. Notice they're covered with scales. Notice they have a dorsal fins. Notice they have caudal. Notice that they have that lateral line we talked about. They have anal fins, and then they have something known as a vent. So again, these are some external features. Also, what we want to think about is that even though they do have gills, some of them are able to actually breathe with a single lung, and they're actually equipped that if the conditions get really dry and they're not getting enough enough oxygen through their gills, they can breathe through their lungs. This is a pretty cool YouTube video on lungfish that you might want to watch. I thought it was interesting, and so I wanted to make sure I posted that link for you. When we think about their scales, now obviously your chondrichthyes have your placoid scales. Other osteichthyes are going to have ganoid, cycloid, or tetanoid scales. And again, I'm not going to make you know each one of those, but just basically know that they're more, most of the time they're more rounded. They kind of overlap each other, especially more overlap than in the case of sharks. Remember that they do have paired fins. Also remember that the bone is, their body is made out of skeleton instead of, their skeleton is made out of bone rather than cartilage. So again, when we think about that, then of course they're going to be able to make their red blood cells from that as well. Unlike your sharks and your rays, they do not do internal fertilization. They do external fertilization. The female they'll build their bed, and the female will swim along, deposit her eggs. The male will come right behind her. He will spray out his milt, M-I-L-T. The milt will settle down on the eggs, fertilize them, and then the male and or the female will usually stay on the eggs. When I say stay on them, not on them, but above them and kind of aerate them and things like this. So often you'll hear of fishermen wanting to catch fish when they're bedding, and that's because they won't go away from the shallows. They kind of stay in the shallows in a very easy to find location to protect their brood. When we think of osteichthyes, I think color. Every color of the rainbow is going to be seen in the class osteichthyes. Every shape, every size, every layout, possible layout you'll see here. So again, when I think of osteichthyes, they're a very large group. They're a very diverse group. Matter of fact, here's one that's a flounder. Flounders are flat, just like halibut and some other fish like sole. They start out bilateral, but they very quickly in their development, as they are hatch, they begin to turn over on their side. Their right eye actually migrates over to the left side, and they actually adapt to being bottom dwellers. So again, very interesting. Neat to see some key features, some key terms that we want to make sure that you know. You definitely need to know lateral line. Remember, this lateral line picks up chemicals in the water, senses pressure in the water. This is how fish can act as a large mass. In other words, one fish is swimming next to another one. They kind of sense the pressure difference, between them and the other fish. Therefore, if one fish sees something, I don't know, a barracuda, a shark, a seal, something like a penguin, they'll turn. When they do, that creates a difference in the pressure between them and the other fish. This will then trigger that fish to move, which triggers the next one, the next one, the next one, and this is how they move almost as in synchronous swimming patterns, and they almost appear to be one large fish rather than several small ones. We also know that fish tend to show counter shading. Counter shading is where they're darker at the top, lighter at the bottom. This is an advantage so that predators cannot see them. If a predator from on top of the fish looked down, the fish would blend in with the substrate. The fish would have the same coloration on top as the soil, not the soil, but the ground or gravel or sand around them. Likewise, if a fish is swimming and a predator is looking up at the sun, looking up at the fish's bottom will be lightly colored. Therefore, the fish will appear to blend in with the day sky. They also have, I mentioned the swim bladder. Those are found only in your osteichthyes. I mentioned spawning. I talked about the female laying the eggs, the male coming behind her, releasing his milt and allowing that to settle down on the eggs, thus fertilizing them. We talked about your chondrichthyes, the male sharks and the male rays having specialized fins on their anal fin called claspers, and this is what they impregnate the female with. And then we also talked about the fact that fish have an incredible sense of smell, and this is how they find their food source, this is how they find their mates, this is how they mark territory and identify territory. So again, smell is a very important feature for these animals as well. Okay?